Aloha and namaste, everyone. It's 4 p.m. here in New York City. I'm John Heilemann, in for Nicole Wallace. $787.5 million. Not pocket change, and the precise price that Fox News is now paying for having repeatedly and wantonly aired the false, insidious, incendiary claims about the 2020 election out of the mouth of the disgraced, twice impeached, now indicted former president, and the amen chorus of enablers, abettors, sycophants, toadies, lapdogs, and co-conspirators on his own legal team and at Fox News itself. That $787.5 million settlement, it's one of the largest ever for a defamation case in U.S. history, and it's by no means the end of the pursuit for accountability from those who knowingly, willingly, readily spread the big lie. As the New York Times notes, quote, Dominion Voting Systems did more on Tuesday than settle a lawsuit against Fox News for $787.5 million. Also set the tone for the many related defamation cases that it has filed. The targets of Dominion's remaining lawsuits, few of which have deep pockets and legal firepower at Fox's level, will likely take a cue from Dominion and Fox's face-off, legal experts said. Dominion has 6 more defamation lawsuits on deck involving far-right media outlets such as Newsmax, One American News, election deniers such as Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, and of course our favorite, the MyPillow guy, Mike Lindell. As for Fox News itself and the Murdoch family, this could be just the start of their legal woes. NBC News reporting last week that a Fox Corporation shareholder is suing the Murdochs and several members of the Fox Corp board over Fox's post-election coverage. And Reuters reporting that other shareholders are also seeking records from Fox ahead of what could become another potential lawsuit against the board. The network also faces an additional monster defamation lawsuit, Smartmatic, suing Fox to the tune of $2.7 billion for airing claims that purportedly, quote, decimated that company. The Washington Post notes, in a nearly 300-page complaint filed in New York State Supreme Court in February 2021, Smartmatic alleges that Fox News knowingly made, quote, over 100 false statements and implications about the company, amplifying false information from former President Donald Trump and his allies, that Smartmatic played a role in his election loss. In February, a New York appeals court ruled that the case was allowed to proceed. And as an attorney for Smartmatic noted yesterday, quote, Dominion's litigation exposed some of the misconduct and damage caused by Fox's disinformation campaign. Smartmatic will expose the rest. That's what we call a tease in the TV business. Sure to figure into Smartmatic's calculations the very fact that Fox is now shelling out more than $750 million in cold hard cash for its coverage of Team Trump's conspiracy theories. As Dominion attorney Davita Brooke put it, money can be a form of accountability. Let's take a listen to that from yesterday.
Over the past 2.5 years, we've been able to expose everything that Fox knew when it broadcast these horrific lies about my company. The country now knows that. The world now knows that. And with the summary judgment ruling we got from this great court, we now have a decision that those lies were clearly just that. The other thing we needed was justice. And you know how a company like Fox apologizes? It apologizes with money. And $787 million, we figured, spoke volumes.
That was not yesterday. That was this morning. And the attorney who we just saw there, Davita Brooks, is joining us now. She's a lawyer for Dominion Voting Systems and a partner at the law firm Sussman Godfrey. She's also representing Dominion in its defamation lawsuits against Giuliani, Powell, and the Pillow Guy, plus OAN and Newsmax. Davita, great to see you. Congratulations. I'm curious about just to talk to us a little bit about when this case started. We could go back and kind of think about the history here a little bit. You know, as an attorney going into this matter, you guys would have thought from the very beginning about litigation strategy. And I'm curious about, like, as you started out down the path here, what you thought you were trying to achieve at the outset.
It's a great question. And I will admit that over the last couple of hours, I have been thinking a lot about how this all got started. And the two things that we were really trying to achieve from day one were accountability and justice for our client. And what I mean by that is, with accountability, we needed to set the record straight. We needed the world to know that the lies that were told about Dominion in the wake of the 2020 presidential election were false. And we needed them to see that for themselves. And that was our summary judgment brief. And that was the decision from this court in Delaware. And we think that we achieved those goals in spades. The other thing we needed was a fair result for our client. And that was yesterday, $787 million. The largest verdict I know, the largest settlement I know of in any defamation case in the history of this country. And again, that number mattered to Dominion, and we think it mattered to Fox.
So one of the things that people, I think, who are, I'm not a lawyer, but I've covered them enough to know that, you know, sort of the point of the civil litigation system in America is not to go to trial. It's a system that's designed to get to settlement. That, you know, trials are inherently unpredictable. You never know on both sides what's going to happen in front of a jury. You're kind of trying to find a number in the end. And for a lot of these kind of lawsuits, from the very beginning of discovery and putting the case together, you're thinking about trying to get to settlement, about what a fair number would be. Is that how you guys thought about this? Because you just equated money with justice. You've equated money with accountability. I guess my question is whether from the very beginning you thought, we have a number in mind. We're going to end up in a settlement negotiation for sure. And that's where we think this will end up. And then there's a series of things we might want to also get done along the way.
Not at all, actually. Sussman Godfrey is a trial firm. When Dominion hired Sussman Godfrey to help them in this fight, what they were signaling to Fox is that they were ready to see the inside of that courtroom. And let me tell you, we were ready to see the inside of that courtroom. This lovely background you see behind me is the glorious war room where I still am in Wilmington, Delaware, where not but 48 hours ago in the room next door to me, my partner, Stephen Shackelford, was practicing his opening for a team of our colleagues. My colleague, Justin Nelson, was practicing his cross of Rupert Murdoch for another team of our colleagues. We were ready to go. That said, there are advantages to settling. And one of the advantages here was not just the money, which is what we were hoping to get from a jury, but it was the peace for the people at Dominion. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of focus on all of the folks from Fox's end who were going to be required to come to court and be questioned. But there were also a dozen or so folks from Dominion who were going to have to leave their homes, leave their comfort, come to Wilmington, Delaware, and relive the very, very real trauma that they experienced in the 2020 presidential election, and frankly, to this day. And deciding to not put them through that, deciding to let them stay at home with their families was a huge factor for my client and something that weighed very heavily on him in making this decision.
Davida, you just, in doing a little bit of that colorful TikTok there, you gave a couple tidbits to all of the people who are writing books about this. And someone at home is writing a screenplay for the HBO miniseries about this. They'll be calling you soon to get more on that colorful TikTok. And I might come back to it before this interview is over. But I do want to just ask you one more question about settlement, right? There's been a suggestion over the course of the last 24 hours that it was important to the company that all of the facts that we learned in the course of you doing discovery, and then a lot of that material, not all of it, but a lot of that material coming out in the course of the various filings that you had starting in December, January. We learned a lot about what was going on at Fox News in these pivotal days after the election. Is it the case that you had settlement offers that preceded all of that information becoming public, that you decided to wait and to really seriously engage in the settlement negotiations until after all that public disclosure? Or did the settlement negotiations really only begin on the brink of trial?
What I'll say about that is this. I think it's notable that this settlement happened after that summary judgment briefing I mentioned, after that summary judgment decision I mentioned. It was very important for not just Dominion, but for Staple Street Capital, who has been with Dominion every single step of this way, to make sure that the record was set straight, that the world saw what we saw, that the world knew what we knew via the documents and the briefing that we put together. And it was hugely, hugely important to us to get that ruling from the court that it is crystal clear that Dominion had nothing to do with any bad activity in the 2020 presidential election.
I could see your eyes light up still at the prospect of having the lost opportunity in some way of what it would have been like to litigate this case. And certainly there were a lot of people who were looking forward to watching it on TV. I kept thinking this is kind of a new trial of the century. It's sort of a combination of the O.J. trial and the Scopes monkey trial. Like everyone in the world was going to be watching this thing all at once. And I guess, for a lot of people, there was a certain sense of letdown yesterday. Even those people who understand that this is a very large settlement, even people who understand the value of having gotten out a lot of the information that we learned about the way that Fox News behaved in the aftermath of the election, people wanted something else. And that thing for a lot of people, as you probably have heard in terms of the coverage in the last 24 hours, was they wanted an apology. They wanted the Fox News anchors to have to go on air and admit that they lied, to take responsibility to a greater degree than they did in the statement that they put out yesterday, which was, I think we'd all admit, pretty innocuous and pretty heavily lawyered. Was that question ever on the table? Was that ever something that you guys thought was important and that you pursued during the settlement negotiations?
Look, there are a lot of executives, hosts, producers, et cetera, at Fox. And if any of them want to do the right thing and come out and apologize, we welcome it. That said, for better or for worse, the legal system, the laws of defamation, they're not set up to get you an apology. We could have gone to trial, knocked it out of the park, and we would not have gotten an apology from Fox. Yeah. We would have gotten a damages. And so at the end of the day, that is what our legal system is set up to provide for. It's set up to provide for accountability and for justice. And when we had ticked those two boxes, we felt like we had done what we had come here to do.
Right. Appreciate that answer. And yet the question still remains. I mean, was that admittedly, the legal system itself was never going to compel Fox News to apologize, but you might have tried to compel them to apologize in some way as part of a settlement negotiation. So I ask you again, was that ever something that you considered or pursued in the course of those negotiations?
I'd really have to turn to my client, but I'm not really sure what the value of a forced apology would be to them at this point. If Fox ever wants to genuinely apologize to Dominion Voting Systems for what they did to them, I know the CEO of Dominion. I'm sure he would listen, but I'm not sure that a forced apology is really going to be that meaningful to him at this point in time.
So one of the things that civil litigation often is designed to do is designed to be a deterrent towards future bad acts, right? So like if you're doing product liability litigation, you're trying to get damages, actual damages, you might pursue punitive damages as you guys were. And part of the goal there is to punish as a deterrent against future behavior that of the same kind. One of the questions that's been going around in the political world, obviously, since the settlement was announced almost exactly 24 hours ago, has been whether this will change anything at Fox News. And I know this isn't a strictly legal question, but I wonder what you think of that. Andrew Weissman was on this show yesterday, raising the prospect that what this would teach Fox was not that it would have to pay large penalties for propagating big lies, but that it could get away with big lies, except if those were directed at other corporations, at deep-pocketed defendants or deep-pocketed potential plaintiffs. So you could steer clear of lying about big companies. You'd be in the clear. I wonder what you think about the degree to which the settlement and the cost that they're having to pay will maybe or not change their behavior in the future on this front.
Sure. I certainly hope it will. And as you said, not just as a lawyer for Dominion, but I'm also just an American. And I, too, lived through the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election, and it shook me to my core. And so I certainly hope that we have all learned something. And I think and I hope what Fox has learned, and again, I go back to the incredible summary judgment opinion that this court has issued in this case, is that a lot of the ideas and the theories and the defenses that Fox had for why it could get away with doing what it did are just not legally sound. There is no such thing as a newsworthiness defense to defamation law. There is no such thing as a neutral report to defamation law in the state of New York, where Fox is. Those things are not going to cut it. And Fox now knows that from this court. And if I were them, I would certainly be very careful of making decisions based on those defenses in the future.
So, as I said before, as you described the last hour preparations there in the war room, where you're what was once the war room and now is where you guys signed, I guess, like the peace treaty. Going into ahead of what would have been the start of the trial yesterday, there's some tantalizing kind of images that play out before your eyes of what might have been. You guys released a monster exhibit list yesterday, 7,000 pages. And I'm curious, without going into, obviously, the individual piece of evidence that you were going to enter into the record in the case if it had gone forward. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what we might have learned more about Fox News's behavior had this trial proceeded. What would we have, if there's anything substantively additional to all the bad acts that we've learned about already? What else would we have learned in the course of the trial had it gone forward?
Well, the public would have gotten to hear for themselves more from the hosts and the producers and the executives at issue. Our witness list was also public, and those are the people that we were planning on bringing to trial either live or by deposition testimony. And so you would have heard from them, and you would have heard more about what their contemporaneous documents at the time had to say.
What was that Murdoch? Murdoch, you pointed out one of your colleagues was prepping for doing the Murdoch interrogation. What would that have looked like? How many days would it have stretched out? What would the forum have been for that? How soon would we have seen him if there had been a trial?
Those are a lot of questions that were still, some of them in flux, even as we were on the courtroom steps there. But my colleague, Justin Nelson, who is the same person who took Murdoch's deposition that has already been discussed at a pretty great length in the press, was gearing up to once again question Mr. Murdoch on the stand in the first week of the trial.
In the first week, and it would have been, the Murdoch was going to be in person for that? That was going to be a face-to-face encounter?
Yes, the court, I actually don't want to speak out of turn. I think that eventually Fox acknowledged that as an officer of the company, Mr. Murdoch would have to appear in person in Delaware.
I was looking forward to that being a multi-day extravaganza, one of the high points of my year. And yet you guys denied it to us yesterday by doing the settlement. I think I'll never possibly forgive you. There was one thing on that list of 7,000 pages that I mentioned that stood out, were a series of emails between Rupert Murdoch and Jared Kushner. Curious if you can tell us what that was about or what those were about.
Now you're being unfair. Now you're testing my knowledge of that 7,000 page exhibit list on live TV. And that one's that one's below the belt.
All right. It's not below the belt. I'm just fishing. You guys, you promised us this trial. You took it away. I'm just trying to give us some kind of grist for the mill here going forward. How many of the Fox News hosts do you think you were going to call in the end?
They're all on that exhibit list. There were quite a handful of them, included Tucker Carlson, Maria Bartiromo, Jeanine Pirro, Sean Hannity, Will Cain, and maybe a couple more.
The further we go into this conversation, the more painful it gets because the sense of denial is all the more acute and just the spectacle that we would have been able to see. I say again, I think it's without doubt that this case has done more to make substantive, concrete, and vivid for people the extent to which Fox News does not operate as a traditional news organization, but rather as a propaganda organization, especially at a moment of great precariousness and peril for the United States back in the wake of the 2020 election. And so on behalf of a welcome public that just wants to know more about the news media, I say thank you and also congratulations on what I'm sure your client thinks was a very big win. Davida Brooke, appreciate you for coming on today.
Thank you.
Let's bring in now, still live from Wilmington, Delaware, New York Times political reporter Jeremy Peters. He was inside the courtroom yesterday. Jeremy, you've had 24 hours, having spent a lot of your life since this case started to unfold. You spent many hours getting ready for this trial. You've now had 24 hours to kind of process what happened. Just give me your highest level kind of overview on what you've been thinking over the last 24 hours and what you thought listening to Davida Brooke just now, and whether there was anything that she said that really stood out for you as being of any particular moment or importance.
I think, John, the question of accountability is a really good and powerful one, because that's what this case for Dominion was really all about. And it's what this case was about for many of the people who were so invested in it. We have yet to see many people who were responsible for spreading lies and misinformation about the 2020 election really held legally accountable for that. And Davida is right when she says money is a form of accountability. And certainly this is 787 million ways that Fox is being held to account. And I think there's another point here that's been a little overlooked about the significance of this case, even though it's not going to trial and we won't get to see Tucker Carlson and Rupert Murdoch on the stand. What we have been able to see, though, is for months and months and months, disclosures from inside Fox News that Dominion was able to bring to light because they filed a lawsuit. So we now know how disingenuous Fox hosts like Tucker Carlson can be with their audience, how they privately denigrate the president that they know their audience doesn't want criticized. So what do? They say things, snipe about him privately, but then say something completely different on the air. That curtain has been peeled back, and we wouldn't have that without Dominion's lawsuit, even though we're not going to have a trial.
Jeremy, the question I asked Davida that I think is in some ways the biggest question coming out of all this is this question around deterrence. And does the outcome that was achieved by Dominion, whether it will have a meaningful effect on the way that Fox News does business going forward? And I think there's one school of thought which says this is a large settlement. They're writing a giant check. Of course, this is the only thing that corporations react to is to the bottom line. This will be a deterrent. Money is accountability, et cetera, et cetera. And there's another that says, for Fox News, this is not a drop in the bucket, but it's survivable. And that the lesson they will learn is, hey, you can lie about a lot of things. Just don't lie about a potential plaintiff that has deep pockets and can take you to court. Which of those do you think is more likely to play out being a student of the company as you are?
So, look, I think that this is not fundamentally going to change the way that Fox does business. It's realized here that it can write a check, a big check at that, and that is how it continues to tell its audience what it wants to hear. I mean, remember, this is all about ratings and the profits that those high ratings generate. Fox is not going to do anything to get crosswise with its audience. One of the things that we know from the discovery in this case and the emails going back and forth between Rupert Murdoch and his chief executive, Suzanne Scott, is that they really panicked when they saw the ratings decline, and they worried about the share price. They worried about the cost to the company ultimately. Well, it was a pretty high cost in terms of what the Dominion case brought about, but I just don't see Fox ever deciding that its business interests are in moving toward becoming more moderate and the kind of network maybe that Paul Ryan would like to see as a member of Fox's corporate board, which we know he was pushing Rupert Murdoch to in that direction to try to back away from Trump. Fox is only going to back away from Trump when their audience tells them that Trump is not their choice for the Republican nomination. He's no longer the leader of the Republican Party. And that's just not the situation we're looking at right now.
Jeremy Peters, thank you for spending some time with us. And you are now free, all due respect to President Biden, you're now free to leave Delaware. When we come back after this historic $750 million, that's with a B, $750 million settlement, there are still victims of election disinformation out there. We will talk with constitutional law scholar Lawrence Tribe about that and where we go from here. Plus, we're hearing from the Fulton County District Attorney in the form of a court filing today. The first new detail since she warned that charging decisions are imminent in the ex-president's effort to overturn the 2020 election. What we know and what it says about this monumental case, and an ominous decision from the Supreme Court today. High Court buying themselves a little more time around a case that will have huge consequences for women's reproductive health and freedom. What could be going on behind the scenes? We'll discuss the stakes for millions of people in this country, all of those stories and more when Deadline White House continues after this. Please, I beg of you, do not go anywhere.
It was a pitch black night in the high desert. Sheriff's Deputy Billy Cox drove over the park and ride in Palmdale. Something very wrong around that bright blue Mustang. A woman's left leg and bare foot were hanging out of the door. L.A. County Homicide Detective Richard Longshore was sound asleep when he got the call.
There are cases that you will take home with you at night, and that will last till the end of your life.
I'm Keith Morrison, and this is The Girl in the Blue Mustang, a podcast from Dateline.
Listen to all episodes now, wherever you get your podcasts.
A reminder today that despite the mountain of evidence showing that the big lie was just that, a big, fat, dangerous lie, and despite the fact that a media giant, namely Fox News Corporation, is now paying $787.5 million for giving platforms to that lie, disinformation about our elections is still running rampant across the country. The New York Times reporting, quote, Jair Garcia, the head of elections in Tarrant County, Texas, announced this week that he would resign, joining other beleaguered election officials across the nation who have quit after facing threats. Mr. Garcia oversees elections in a county where, in 2020, Donald J. Trump became only the second Republican presidential candidate to lose in more than 50 years. Right-wing skepticism of the election results fueled threats against Mr. Garcia, though the county received acclaim from state auditors for its handling of the 2020 voting. Joining us now, longtime constitutional scholar and Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe, my friend. Professor Tribe, I want to get you quickly first just to talk a little bit about what you think the net is on the Dominion case and the settlement, whether you think it will deter Fox News, whether you think it was whether the settlement achieved as much as Dominion and its attorneys claim that it has, or whether you're a little disappointed in either the settlement itself or not getting to see this case go to trial.
Well, it would have been fun to watch the trial, but I think it was a great victory for Dominion and ultimately for the truth. The remarkable volume of evidence that emerged showing that Fox News lied and knew it was lying would have been amplified a little at the trial, but we got most of it in the remarkable run-up to the trial. The verdict of 767 million, that was an amazing verdict because the actual damages that Dominion was able to quantify economically was closer to 112 million. So the ratio of 6-1 is probably as much as any court would have permitted. Besides, you have to discount the 1.7 billion that they were seeking, or 1.67 billion, by the probability, and it's not more probable than not, but it was a significant risk that an appellate court would have overturned any verdict at the end of a trial, because the rulings in favor of Dominion were really very dramatic. Some of those rulings, which I think were correct, were nonetheless close to the line. So what Dominion did was essentially cash in when it might have ended up walking away with nothing. It seems to me also, as Davida pointed out, that a forced apology, which isn't something that the civil justice system is designed to deliver anyway, wouldn't have helped anything. I mean, for Hannity or one of these guys to go on the air and wink and nod and say, yeah, we weren't telling the truth, who would have believed that they actually meant it? Their audience wouldn't have believed it. Their audience didn't even learn today the size of the settlement amount. So it seems to me that this was a very important victory for truth and for Dominion and for all of the people in Dominion who have been spared the difficulties of a trial, which would have been a burden for them.
But before I move on, Larry, to the questions of what comes next, because of all these other cases that are going forward, including the Smartmatic case, I do want to ask you about that. Come back to that question about deterrence and whether or not. And there's kind of two schools of thought here. One is that Fox News is not going to suddenly change its spots and become CNN or MSNBC, God knows. But is this a large enough settlement that it could have an appreciable impact on their coverage? Or is the lesson here, as some legal minds, including our friend Andrew Weissman, who was on yesterday, will the lesson be for Fox News, big lies are fine. We just can't tell big lies about deep-pocketed corporations who might turn into dangerous plaintiffs?
I'm inclined to agree with Andrew. I think they're going to keep telling lies. I think they're going to avoid lying about particular plaintiffs who can then sue them. That doesn't mean that big lies will remain undeterred permanently. What this does is underscore the importance of what Fannie Willis in Fulton County, Georgia, and Jack Smith, the special counsel, are able to do in holding Trump and Trump's allies accountable for the attempted coup that was based on the big lie and for the insurrection that the big lie fomented. In a way, what people haven't yet focused on is that it is the criminal justice system that vindicates the great public interest, the interest in democracy. The civil justice system can make a victim whole, but it can't make the country whole. No amount of lawyering, and the lawyering by Stephen Shackelford and DeVita and Justin was absolutely brilliant. No amount of good lawyering, however good, could have vindicated the full national interest. That's going to depend very much on the DA of Fulton County and on the special counsel. And that's the way the system is designed, and that's the way it ought to work. And I'm quite optimistic that when the final history of this period is written, the big lie will have been exposed, the big liar will have been held accountable, and those who were injured by the liars at Fox will have been made whole. You can't ask for much more out of the system. And if you want entertainment, then you go to the movies.
Yeah, I was going to say from your lips to Earl Warren's ears, if he's listening. Here's what I want to play one piece of sound here, because it is the case that Fox News will continue on regardless of what happens to Donald Trump, even with all the consequences that you potentially laid out there in the Georgia case, in the Jack Smith inquiries in Washington, D.C., the special counsel. There are all these other lawsuits. There's the Smartmatic lawsuit. There are the potentially the shareholder lawsuits against Fox News. This is going to go on for a while. And I want to play just to remind people, you've gotten used to hearing about Dominion voting systems. You're going to start hearing about Smartmatic again with its $2.6 billion lawsuit against Fox News. That's the next big defamation case. Let's play this one piece of sound here to remind you. Here's Sidney Powell back in November of 2020 talking not just about Dominion, but about this other voting systems company called Smartmatic that's also suing Fox News. Let's listen to that.
We now have reams and reams of actual documents from Smartmatic and Dominion, including evidence that they planned and executed all of this.
The president's lawyers alleging a company called Dominion, which they say started in Venezuela with Cuban money and with the assistance of Smartmatic software, a backdoor is capable of flipping votes.
They were being notified by Smartmatic in Frankfurt that Biden was way behind and they better come up with a lot more ballots. And we can prove every single thing I just said.
So, Professor Tribe, it's been easily forgotten that in that period that really Dominion and Smartmatic were, as you just heard, they were kind of like the Bobbsey twins out of the mouths of the conspiracists on Fox News, Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani and others. You only heard the name of Dominion in the context of Smartmatic, and vice versa. They were like the two great Satans here that the big lie propagators always cited. And I guess I wonder what the large question here, which is, having had this kind of a settlement in the Dominion case, how does the specter of that settlement hover over the Smartmatic case? Or does it not? And to the extent it does, how does it? And over all of these ancillary legal cases, is there an appreciable effect from this settlement that will now kind of change the course of history on all these other legal forums and all these other legal filings?
Well, sure, there's an effect. It's not a straight line legal effect. It's more like the guillotine, the shadow of the guillotine, like the sword of Damocles. It has its effect not just when it falls, but while it hangs. And it's overhanging in the lawsuits that are going to be brought by Smartmatic and in the remaining suits by Dominion. Now everybody knows that Dominion is willing to pay north of $650, maybe $750 million in order to get rid of one of these lawsuits. And there are individuals who are going to be sued, and there are other companies being sued, and there are other plaintiffs suing. We now have a different baseline. We're moving out of a world where people thought that the difficulty of proving reckless or deliberate falsehood and meeting the high standard of New York Times v. Sullivan would make these lawsuits impossible to win. But we have a summary judgment ruling by a very serious court, a ruling rejecting a number of defenses as illegitimate under the relevant governing law. and we have a clear sense of what kind of evidence can be introduced. So if I were Davida, and if I were Justin, and if I were my former student, Stephen Shackelford, I wouldn't throw away those notes for the opening argument just yet. The cases are not over.
Yeah.
There's plenty more.
Yeah, it sounds to me from Davida, it sounds to me like they're going to hold on to those notes and that they're ready to go. I'll just point out what we said before. Attorney for Smartmatic yesterday saying, quote, Dominion's litigation exposed some of the misconduct and damage caused by Fox's disinformation campaign. Smartmatic will expose the rest. And again, I say from their lips to God's ears, Lawrence Tribe, thank you for taking the time today. We're going to switch gears, and we have a big development in the Fulton County, Georgia case that Larry Tribe was just talking about, where the ultimate accountability for the big lie, one of the places where the ultimate accountability for the big lie resides, or may reside, will reside, should reside. The district attorney down there looking to remove a lawyer from representing the 10 fake Trump electors in 2020. We'll tell you why she's doing that and what it tells us about where this case may be going. Coming up. With all the focus on the Fox News Dominion case over the last few days, you may have kind of put to the side, forgotten, taking your eye off the ball when it comes to the case unfolding down in Georgia related to Donald Trump and election fraud. We have not. We're right back on it today with the news today coming out of Fulton County, where that investigation into Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 election have yielded for the first time some news. Since District Attorney Fani Willis suggested that charging decisions in the case were imminent. This is the first news since then, is what we're saying. We're hearing from her in the form of an intriguing new court filing. Among the revelations in this court filing, Willis has conducted some fresh interviews as recently as last week with a number of so-called fake electors, Republican activists who falsely claimed to be Georgia's legitimate electors in the aftermath of the election. According to the filing, some of last week's interviews, some of those electors stated that another elector, represented by the same lawyer, Kimberly DeBrow, quote, committed acts that are violations of Georgia law and that they were not party to these additional acts. Willis is now seeking to disqualify DeBrow, who's accused of creating, quote, an impracticable and ethical mess. Late this afternoon, DeBrow told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution the prosecutor's allegations are, quote, baseless, false, and offensive, adding that she, quote, ethically and professionally represents her clients at all times. Joining us now from the aforementioned Atlanta Journal-Constitution, MSNBC contributor and ace Georgia reporter Greg Bluestein, and the one and only Harry Littman. He's with us, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General and former U.S. Attorney. Greg, do what you always do for me in these situations, which is help me understand what's going on in this case and in your state. I read that script. I've been paying attention to this all day. I still don't totally understand what's happening. So talk to us about what Fani Willis is alleging here, and then I'm going to have Harry explain it.
Yeah, it really is complicated. One thing that really stands out, and you mentioned it, is that prosecutors are still very actively grilling potential witnesses and potential targets in this case as recently as just a few days ago, as last week. Even with the decision on indictments looming, this indicates to me and to legal analysts as well that this investigation is still very much ongoing. And it's important because this is the first major development in this case since Fani Willis described an imminent decision way back in January on whether she'd file charges. And you've also got this intensifying clash between not just between her office and the fake electors, but also between the fake electors themselves, because several fake electors describe potential violations of an unspecified state law by another fake elector. So it's a sign that there's disunity and tension within the group of fake electors right now.
So basically, we have a fake elector food fight and disunity and dissension in the MAGA world. Boy, talk about headline news there. That's like kind of dog bites man news. Harry, what is Fani Willis complaining about? Like, what's she on about here, and what does it mean that she's trying to get this lawyer kicked off the case?
All right. So what she is saying is this lawyer represents 10 electors, can't do it. There's a conflict. You can't represent people who are opposed to one another in their interests. And they had interviews last week, as Scott was saying, where the guy said, somebody else who represents, who this woman also represents, in fact, did it. I didn't. And she is also, Fani Willis, saying, we offered immunity before and the lawyer didn't pass it along. The lawyer, oddly, is saying this is a complete lie. and something's going to give on that. But the tantalizing detail is that they are focused so much on the electors. And yes, it's a food fight, but that's food fight that prosecutors love, because what it suggests is you can put on one elector, give them immunity, and they will inculpate others. So it does show that part of it, remember, this is sort of a two-tiered case, everything in Georgia and also the national figures. It suggests that where everybody, including I, have been thinking there's a new grand jury coming in May, that's when she'll pull the trigger. There's some work yet to be done if she wants to parcel out immunity to certain of the electors. You have to, debrief them, put them in front of a grand jury. So there's also that secondary kind of timing point that it suggests.
Yeah, Harry, I'll just stick with you and just draw that point out to put a fine point on it, so to speak. I mean, I think if you had asked people who follow Trump's legal entanglements and challenges a couple months ago what the likely sequence of indictments, if there were going to be indictments, would come, it was Manhattan, Georgia, and then the Washington case, the Washington, D.C. cases under the special counsel. And that a lot of people thought the Georgia indictments could be, as Fani Willis had said, imminent. It feels to me, again, I admit to being a little bit baffled by some of the legalese in here, and taking a deep walk in the legal woods. But it does sound to me, on the basis of everything, that she's on this case, she's focused on it, but the ways in which she's focused on it suggest that this thing could take a while. We could be waiting for her now this might be many, many, many more, not just weeks, but months before we get to a decision on whether they're going to be an indictment or not.
So maybe, and you're right. It's not about legalese. She said imminent, and then she said, by that I don't mean coming soon. So it's an understandable confusion. A lot of people, there's reason that she will want, all things being equal, to bring an indictment at the beginning of a grand jury sitting. That actually helps her potentially in speedy trial terms. So a lot of people were focused. The next grand jury comes in early May. It may be too soon to do at least this piece of it. She could do it in piecemeal. She could start with one part of the plan and then go to Georgia. And I don't think this suggests a month's delay, but I just don't see how she really gets it together so quickly in the first week in May, if they're still thinking, and that's what the bottom line of this motion says to me, they're still thinking of giving immunity out to some electors so that they will testify against other electors.
I'm looking at my calendar here, Harry. I believe it says it's April 19th today. April 19th, man, May, first week in May, it's like we're just around the corner. That's not very long. Hard to imagine this thing could get done that quickly. I think you may be right. Greg and Harry, they're sticking around. We'll be back with some breaking news in one and maybe two of special counsel Jack Smith's investigations into Donald Trump. As promised, we have some breaking news regarding the investigations being run by special counsel Jack Smith down in Washington, D.C. The New York Times reporting this, quote, Boris Epstein, top advisor to former President Donald J. Trump, is scheduled to be interviewed on Thursday by prosecutors in the office of the special counsel Jack Smith. According to people familiar with the matter, the latest example of the Justice Department's efforts to secure testimony and evidence from current and former close aides to Mr. Trump. It remained unclear what subjects the prosecutors wanted to discuss with Mr. Epstein, but given his expansive ties to Mr. Trump, Mr. Epstein is in a position to provide information in both of the investigations that Mr. Smith is overseeing. One focused on Mr. Trump's efforts to retain power after losing the 2020 election, and the other centered on his handling of classified documents after he left the White House. Harry, one of the things that's most striking about what's going on with Jack Smith down in Washington is his focus on the lawyers. Boris Epstein, until recently, had been kind of the guy who was coordinating Trump's legal efforts in both of the Jack Smith inquiries, kind of like an in-house counsel. He's also worked with lawyers defending Trump down in the Fulton County case and in Manhattan. And here comes Jack Smith going after Boris Epstein, someone again he's gone after. Evan Corcoran, he's focused on before. What is it? That seems uncommon to me, a little unusual, not bad or good, but just something you don't see that often. Talk a little bit about the way in which this special counsel seems to be focused in a laser-like way on Trump's lawyers and potentially their complicity in some of his misdeeds.
It's uncommon, it's aggressive, and it is good, John, because Trump, executed so many of his crimes with the help of lawyers, in part relying that they couldn't reveal confidences. But if they're complicit in crimes or furthering crimes that you're able to, you need a lot of procedural approval in the DOJ and from courts that don't give it out lightly, but they have here. Epstein is really he's one of the closest sort of 3 or 4 lawyers. As you say, he's in-house counsel. He's the only guy I can think of as a big role in both Mar-a-Lago, where he's in communication with Corcoran and Christina Robb when they're doing the declaration, but also several of the schemes involving January 6th, including being in touch with Eastman and Meadows. The really tantalizing detail, and my sense of this is this comes from his camp, not the prosecution, is they say they want to interview him. To me, that as opposed to putting him in front of the grand jury, which is what they've been doing lately, to me that suggests they are he is potentially thinking of cooperating. If that's true, that is a big inroad into the case for Smith.
Harry, I haven't had a chance to talk to you about this because we haven't been on the air together that often in the last few months. Is it your sense that I think this will, for those who look at Jack Smith and have seen the way he's been behaving over the last few weeks and months, there's a gathering sense that the dude really has the bit between his teeth and is the hard-charging prosecutor that a lot of people hope for in this case. Is this another piece of evidence that will kind of add to that picture? And is that your general assessment of how Jack Smith is doing on the basis of what we know?
Yes and yes.
Gotta love a man. It's a rare moment where I congratulate Harry Lippman for his brevity and succinctness. But Harry, you were being extremely emphatic there. Greg Bluestein and Harry Lippman, you guys are both great. And yes. Can't do better than that either. Much more to come. Straight ahead, the Supreme Court giving itself 2 more days to decide on a major ruling affecting millions and millions and millions of Americans. We'll tell you what that is right after this quick break. Don't go away.
Hey everyone, I'm Tom Llamas from Top Story on NBC News Now. Every night, Top Story is your news playlist. We take you to the front lines of the story, where it's actually happening, with NBC News journalists on the ground from all over the world. We cover what you need to know and bring your newsfeed to life. And now, Top Story is available as a podcast, so you can listen anytime and anywhere. Subscribe now for new episodes every weeknight.
If what's happening in this court is left to stand, it will in effect be a nationwide ban. One does not have to or need to abandon their faith or deeply held beliefs to agree. The government should not be telling her what to do. Right?
Aloha and namaste again, everyone. It is 5 p.m. now in Gotham City. I'm John Heilemann in for Nicole Wallace. Today, the United States Supreme Court extended its temporary pause on a lower court's ruling on abortion medication, meaning that access to the abortion pill, mifepristone, remains intact, at least for now. The 2-day extension, the stay issued by Justice Samuel Alito, means the court now has until Friday night at 11:59 p.m. to decide whether to uphold the ruling by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals limiting access to the drug, which has been used by approximately 5 million people over the past 2 decades. Before the stay was extended, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre reiterated the administration's readiness to fight over this issue.
We are prepared for any outcome the Supreme Court may issue, and we are prepared for a long legal fight if necessary. You've heard me say this before, and we will continue to stand with FDA's evidence-based approval of mifepristone. As we know, that's been around for more than 20 years. It is used in more than 60 countries, and we will continue to support FDA's independent expert authority to review, approve, and regulate a wide range of prescription drugs.
As we have been discussing for a while now, the stakes for this decision are indeed monumental for abortion access and could also set a precedent for other prescription drugs. As Axios notes, quote, if upheld, it would mark the first time a court has ordered an FDA-approved drug off the market decades after it has been approved. As we await the Supreme Court's final decision late Friday night, at least by Friday night, just before midnight, today's Republican Party has been digging its heels in ever deeper into rolling back the rights of women to have control over their own bodies. In the wake of the Dobbs decision, more than a dozen states have banned abortion. And Florida, just last week, enacted a new 6-week abortion ban. Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis signing that bill into law late Thursday night with a lot less fanfare than he did last year for Florida's 15-week ban, a potential signal that even Republican leaders are beginning to recognize how politically perilous extreme abortion bans can be. From the Washington Post, quote, how it appears from the outside is that DeSantis, a man rumored to be gearing up for a 2024 presidential run, has doubts that his new law will make him look good to a national electorate, in which case he is wise to pass the 6-week abortion ban under the cover of night because Americans want access to abortion. They support it overwhelmingly, and it turns out that many conservative lawmakers either do not understand or do not care about that. Joining us now, president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, Minnie Timaraju. Also with us, Fatima Gosgraves, the president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center, and MSNBC legal analyst Barbara McQuaid. She is here, former U.S. attorney, now a law professor at the University of Michigan. Ladies, great to see you all. Fatima, let me start with you. Give me your sense of what we're to make of the extension that the Supreme Court put out today, giving itself another 48 hours to make up its mind about this.
Well, the most important thing is there's still a couple more days where medication abortion and mifepristone in particular is unaffected and still available. But we don't know, right? We don't know if the delay is because justices are writing separate opinions or that they don't have a majority. In typical times, what would happen is this case would have long ago been dismissed and the Supreme Court would send it back to Kaczmarek with instructions to dismiss because it should have never been there in the first place. So it's hard to have a sound prediction in this moment.
Barb, I'm going to ask you I very rarely invite lawyers to speculate, but in this case, I'm going to open the invitation, open the door to your speculation. Tea leaf reader, student of the court that you are, what do you, as you think about the potential scenarios playing out here behind closed doors up at the Supreme Court, what do you think might be going on back there?
Yeah, it's very interesting, John. I think there's probably 3 possible scenarios here. One is that they decide to preserve the status quo. Mifepristone stays on the market, and they have the case work its way through the court. Of course, the trial court there only found a preliminary injunction. There's not been a trial, and allow that case to play it out. The worst case scenario, I suppose, is to say there's not a stay on that order, and mifepristone is off the market, and the FDA approval is suspended while the case works its way through. But I think there is a third option, which Fatima just talked about there, which is to say what I think is the right outcome here, which is to say these plaintiffs lack standing to bring this lawsuit. And the lawsuit should simply be dismissed and done now. We're not going to look at the merits. This is a group of doctors who have speculated that someday they might have to deliver a fetus with some sort of abortion gone wrong. That is not the kind of harm that is typically required in a case. And it is the conservative justices who are usually looking to push back plaintiffs' claims. And so I think that it would be very difficult for them to, in this case, find that, yeah, sure, these folks have standing in light of all of the other cases where they have in the past and in the future want to beat back plaintiffs' claims. So I think that's a possibility, and maybe even the strongest possibility.
Minnie, let me ask you, in the wake of Dobbs, and with good reason, a lot of American women now assume the worst on the part of the U.S. Supreme Court and just are expecting the most terrible outcome here. Talk about what happens if 48 hours from now or sometime between now and Friday night at 11:59, if the appeals court's decision is upheld and what that will mean in the real world.
You know, we're already living in a moment of complete chaos for patients and providers across the country, even in states where folks went to the ballot box and made sure their constitutions protected abortion access, like this Supreme Court said they would. They said they sent this back to the states. They would not be meddling in abortion anymore. Even in states like California and Michigan, where we've enshrined abortion access through the popular vote, we're seeing chaos and crisis. Folks don't know what information they can share. Providers are having to catch up rapidly every single day with the news. It's never a good sign when providers have to talk to lawyers before they're making health decisions for their patients. So we can expect more of that chaos if this goes the wrong way this weekend. But I think I want to just echo what Barb and Fatima said. This case should have never been heard. The fact that this case has gone so far is really problematic. And look, we're working on a lot of issues. One of them is court reform. The confidence in this court right now is very, very low. So hopefully the justices do the right thing and follow the strict rules they've set for standing.
Fatima, as bad as the Dobbs decision was from the point of view of a lot of people, it was not a ruling that outlawed abortion. It was a ruling that threw this matter back to the states. It took away the right to an abortion, but not abortion itself. Now we're talking about something that goes considerably further if this appeals court ruling was upheld. I want to put up a poll here from CBS News and YouGov about what the country thinks about where abortion is legal, what the abortion pill should be. It should be available. This is what it says here. Where abortion is legal, the abortion pill should be available. 67% of Americans saying that, unavailable 33%. That's an even stronger endorsement than for abortion itself. And yet the question that's at stake here is whether this court is willing to go further in some ways, in many ways, in a core way than it did with the Dobbs decision, and start talking about a gradual outlawing of abortion itself, or the mechanisms and means by which abortion takes place. Talk about what that could spawn in terms of where the law could take us if this is the first step towards that.
We always knew that for anti-abortion extremists, the end goal was not Dobbs. It wasn't saying each state make a determination. It was banning abortion everywhere in this country. And so for those who are just waking up to that reality, that you could live in California, you could live in New York, you can live in the many states that have been expanding abortion access, and there is a drumbeat to undermine access everywhere in this country, that is hard to take. I think you will see the results of that politically, but our law can't take this instability. It cannot be that a year ago they were saying that this is a state-by-state matter, and then today a single judge in Texas can overrule the longstanding process of the FDA to get to the same result. That sort of inconsistency in terms of how we see and view the law is a giant problem.
Barb, every time I do this show, I'm reminded that I'm not a lawyer. And I'm also reminded that I'm really glad I'm not a lawyer. I'm also really glad that I have lawyers like you to help me puzzle through these things. The specter that this mifepristone precedent could basically not just apply to an abortion pill, but also could open a door towards messing with the regulatory status of drugs in states across the country, all kinds of drugs that have nothing to do with abortion. It seems totally crazy, like inconceivable if someone said, there's a court down in Texas that could suddenly wake up one day and tell you that you couldn't get your blood thinner or whatever drug it was that the court decided to render illegal. That seems to be beyond, obviously, the huge importance on the abortion front. This would make an utter travesty of the consistency of the American legal system and how we regulate some pretty basic things that matter a lot to absolutely everybody all the time.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. And I think that, so far we've had a judge make some procedural rulings that there's a likelihood of success on the merits of having these plaintiffs be able to turn back the FDA approval of a drug that's been on the market for 23 years. But again, one of the things that gives me some cautious optimism is this Supreme Court, even with its hostility to the so-called administrative state, I think does not want to set back the entire pharmaceutical industry. I think Big Pharma is pushing very hard here to make sure that once they get FDA approval, which requires years of research and development and investment, then they know they're good to go and they can put that out on the market and that they can profit from it. And that's their business model. If at any point some judge who doesn't like the particular drug can just say, nope, I think it was arbitrary and capricious, and overrule the decision made by that executive body that's been entrusted by the American people to do that work, I think just turns the pharmaceutical industry on its head. And I just think that the Supreme Court justices are not inclined to go so far.
I want to talk about the politics of this a little bit, and Minnie, I want to start with you. I mentioned Ron DeSantis in the Florida 6-week ban when I was reading the intro to this segment. I want to give you a quote from a Washington Post piece by Monica Hesse, who wrote a piece about this. We have a headline here: Republicans are digging themselves into a hole on abortion. Here's the quote: "If you find yourself quietly slipping in your anti-abortion legislation at 11 p.m. when nobody's around to make you defend it, you might wonder whether it's in fact indefensible. If you find yourself proposing measures that are overwhelmingly disapproved of by the people you represent, you might wonder just whom you are representing at all. You might wonder what you stand for, who you stand for, what you actually care about, what you are doing or trying to do." This kind of gets at this question. I mean, even Ron DeSantis down there seemed to be a little bashful about this most recent iteration of his war on women's rights in Florida. And yet across the country, Republicans, even with all of the evidence that we have that this is a political loser, continue to, on the policy front, press further and further. Can you, A, explain to me why you think that is, and B, what you think it is that will, if they are currently ignoring the market signals that this is bad for them politically, what is it that will make them come to realize that opposing the wishes of the vast majority of their constituents is not a great way to keep getting reelected?
So I'll add to that according to a Reuters Ipsos poll, 51% of Republicans believe medication abortions should still be available. So that's the majority of their own base. So look, I mean, I think what the challenge is here is you have a political party that has been in bed with extremist anti-abortion forces for decades. They have been part and parcel of the destruction of this fundamental reproductive freedom in this country, and they can't run away from it now. So you're seeing the conflict happening in real time. You know, Ron DeSantis's ban, the 6-week abortion ban, is so extreme. It's before most people know they're pregnant. And yet he already had a restriction on the books, a ban on the books, and he felt the need to go further. That's because of the inherent, I think, conflict going on in the party. But I just want to be clear, even the members of the party, even the so-called presidential candidates or rumored candidates who are pretending to be moderate are not truly moderate because they're still backing egregious, problematic bans and restrictions across the country. What will it take to wake them up? I think we have to have more fights like Wisconsin, where we just had an overwhelming win in the Supreme Court race. And we're going to see ongoing victories for pro-choice reproductive freedom candidates. We'll see if that puts the Republicans on their heels. But I'll note, not one single GOP presidential nominee or rumored, I shouldn't say nominee yet, rumored candidate or announced candidate had a single statement to make about this case, and it's at the Supreme Court. So that's pretty remarkable.
Fatima, let me ask you this. Here's another really striking example that falls into this category. State of Iowa, not an unimportant state in presidential politics, I will note. It says that it will no longer pay for rape victims' abortions or contraceptives, even though, according to the Des Moines Register, 85% of Iowans, 85% support access to abortion in cases of rape or incest. Again, I've covered politics for a long time, and I'm not an idiot, but I got to say, it does raise a basic kind of question, like what is going on with the Republican Party when it decides to continually get behind pieces of legislation and administrative rulings and regulations that 85% of their voters oppose?
I think what we're going to see over the next year is that there is no abortion ban that is extreme enough in this race to the bottom. And so we will see more and more cool bans. We will see efforts to criminalize doctors, criminalize patients, and people need to remember what they pass. Everyone should be asked about what they think about the Supreme Court case. Ron DeSantis will not be able to run away from a 6-week ban, and no one else who is running should be able to run away from these extreme, outrageous bans and the harm that they will cause to individuals around this country.
Guys, thank you very much for this conversation. Incredibly important, and we'll all be waiting with, I guess, bated breath. I don't know, on the edge of our seat for what the Supreme Court decides. Again, that deadline is 11:59 p.m. on Friday. That's how long they say they are giving themselves to make a final decision about the abortion pill. We have a bit of breaking news right now that we have to come to regarding an effort by House Republicans to push back on Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg's investigation into Donald Trump, which, as you all know well, resulted in the first ever indictment of a former United States president. Federal judge appointed by Donald Trump has refused to block a subpoena from the House Judiciary Committee, that committee led by Jim Jordan, for prosecutor Mark Pomerantz. Pomerantz had worked with the Manhattan DA's office and had overseen the Trump investigation, but left the job after clashing with Bragg. Pomerantz scheduled to appear for a deposition before that committee tomorrow. Barb McQuaid, tell us what inferences to draw and what the implications of that decision are.
Yeah, so, I think anybody who's paid any attention at all knows that this is clearly a sham investigation, investigating the weaponization of a local prosecutor's office. It is normally, a separation between federal and state law, between different branches of government. But Congress does have a very wide swath to investigate anything over which it might grant legislation. And so if it is considering legislation that it is illegal to investigate a former president, for example, this could be something that they want to talk about. If they want to talk about funding initiatives for local prosecutors' offices, this could be something. And so I think that it is, in my view, an absolute abuse of power of the committee to be scrutinizing the work of a county prosecutor's office, but I don't know that any judge can stop them.
All right. Barbara, what do you think we're going to learn from Pomerantz in the end in terms of the substance of this? There's the questions of the law and whether the subpoena should be upheld. Where do you think this is going to put? Is this going to have any real impact in the end on the Trump case here in Manhattan?
I don't. I think that they'll try to make some hay out of it. I think if this were Alvin Bragg or anyone else in that office, they would correctly refuse to answer questions about a pending case. Mark Pomerantz is a little tricky because he's left the office and he's written a book about it. So I think anything that's in his book is probably fair game. So I don't know that any new facts will come out, but certainly they will be presented in a way that look as sinister and nefarious as possible. So politically, it could be damaging. But at the end of the day, I don't know that this does anything that changes the case that gets presented in court against Donald Trump.
Well, that's good to hear. Barbara McQuaid, thank you very much for taking time today. When we return, one day after the Dominion Fox News settlement, election falsehoods are not the only narrative to come out of Fox News night after night after night. How hours and hours of covering the purported demise of America with skyrocketing crime rates, death coming upon us all, has run headfirst into the far right's urgent need to arm everyone. 3 stories with tragic results to tell you about next. Plus, he was supposed to be the GOP savior, the one to lead the party into its post-Trump future. But what we've seen so far from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is convincing more and more people, and not just people, but Republicans, that he's not quite ready for prime time. And a new study showing how red states are increasingly becoming laboratories, not of democracy, but of authoritarianism. We will explain that analysis coming up soon here on Deadline White House after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
I'm Brandy Zadrozny, a senior reporter for NBC News. Do you remember the name Tiffany Dover? You might have heard of her back in 2020. She was one of the frontline medical workers to receive the COVID vaccine when it first rolled out. But when she got her shot on a local news live stream, she fainted, and a conspiracy theory was born. The video of her fainting lit up the internet, and Tiffany Dover, a nurse from Tennessee, became a weapon in a global misinformation war. After that, she disappeared from public view. Her social media went dark, and she never spoke out. Until now.
I wanted to tell my story. I'm so happy to finally be telling it.
Tiffany Dover breaks her silence for the first time.
You're not dead. I am not dead.
Her side of the story, and why we haven't heard from her, in a special episode of Tiffany Dover is Dead, an NBC News podcast. Listen now.
Over at Fox News, aside from all of those election falsehoods that are going to continue to keep their lawyers very busy in the months to come, the other BS narrative that they sow daily is one related to crime. One that's not rooted in crime statistics, the actual crime statistics about what's actually going on in the street, but instead to apocalyptic zombie crime waves coming to a town square near you. And it's that fear-mongering, coupled with an absolutist view of the Second Amendment, that is the cultural backdrop for what we are covering here with these three horrific stories from just the last week. On Thursday, in Kansas City, Missouri, a story you've all heard at this point, a black teenager named Ralph Yarl asked to pick up his younger brothers. 16-year-old mistakenly goes to the wrong house, rings the doorbell. The white homeowner opens the door and shoots Yarl in the head and then a second time in the arm after Yarl is already on the ground. That man now facing 2 felony charges, including first-degree assault. Thankfully, Yarl is now recovering at home. Then on Monday in upstate New York, 20-year-old Kaylin Gillis traveling in a car with 3 friends when they mistakenly turned into the wrong driveway, something I do at least 4 times a day. They never got out of the car, and as they were already turning around, a guy stepped out of the house and fired into the car. One of the bullets killed Gillis, and the homeowner has been charged with murder. And then, finally, last night in Texas, a high school cheerleader mistakenly tried to get into the wrong car in a parking lot, something I also do 5 times a day. When she saw an armed man get out, she got back into her friend's car. And when she rolled down the window to apologize, he fired, critically injuring her and grazing another with a bullet. He has since been charged with deadly conduct. Today on the Senate floor, lead gun control advocate and Democratic Senator Chris Murphy delivered a powerful message and warning about the tragic reality summed up by those 3 stories and so many more.
We are becoming a heavily armed nation, so fearful and angry and hair-trigger anxious that gun murders are now just the way in which we work out our frustrations. Cheerleaders don't need to be shot when they walk into the wrong car. Teenagers don't need to be murdered because their music is too loud. Kids shouldn't fear for their life when they go to school or when they pick up their siblings from a house in the neighborhood. We can do better. We can adjust the dials in order to decide not to live in this dystopia.
Joining me now at this table, Senior Vice President of Law and Policy for Everytown for Gun Safety, Nick Ciplina, and Ben Rhodes, former Obama Deputy National Security Advisor. Great to see both of you guys here, Nick. There are so many things that are so messed up about all these stories, and I don't in any way mean to be glib when I say these are things that, when I say I do them 5 times a day, I do. I mean, people make these mistakes all the time, knocking on the wrong window, knocking on the wrong door, pulling into the wrong driveway. I mean, like, it's just the most common thing in the world. And now increasingly, it's a thing for which you can pay with your life because everyone seems to be, and I don't want to use the wrong pun here, but on a hair trigger, and they're all armed to the teeth.
Yeah, this is what we are seeing time and time again. This is the price of a heavily armed society that is fueled with fear from the gun lobby, that there is crime around every corner and that the only way to make yourself safe is to pack a gun. Fear from the gun industry, right? That's ever innovating towards more dangerous firearms that can kill more quickly because you need to go after the hordes that are, again, just around another corner. And honestly facilitated by weak-kneed lawmakers that are looking to weaken laws whenever they get the chance. The question we have to ask ourselves is, when are the guns going to start making us safer? When is this promise of that the NRA always talks about of a armed society being a polite society going to pan out? Because right now, knocking on the wrong door, pulling on the wrong car handle, pulling into the wrong driveway is met with gunfire. This is not the society we know and have known, honestly, that this is marketing. This is a myth making to sell more guns. Right. And we need to do something about it. We need to end that myth and say, if guns made us safer, we'd be the safest country on earth. And instead, we have a homicide rate that's 25 times that of peer nations. So the time is here to call, BS, as we've been doing across the country, and to do something about it.
So, Ben, you've got a situation here where people talk about, mental illness and, how we deal with the mental illness crisis in America. The main mental illness that a lot of these stories seem to illustrate is paranoia. And you have, according to the 2021 Gallup poll, 88% of U.S. gun owners say that they have a gun for protection, right? What we see in the case with Yarl down in Missouri, is basically, I think, a story of an old white man who saw a black man on his porch and decided he was scared just because the kid was black who had done nothing wrong. But you've got these girls, in this case, the cheerleader. Guy, comes out brandishing a weapon when these girls are in cheerleader outfits and they pulled into the wrong driveway, and this guy's got his gun out and ready. He's already firing at them. You look at the picture we just showed on camera there. It's crazy. I just try to diagnose what it is. I mean, obviously the backdrop is they're all armed, but where's this paranoia? This is the connection I want to make, is this paranoia about crime that's being foisted upon us by people who are peddling that narrative, and how dangerous that combination is.
So there's an information ecosystem that has been built over many years in this country and facilitated, enabled by politicians, mainly Republican politicians, to scare people to death. The example I give, John, that you might remember, just to take it back to the Obama years, is the 2014 midterm elections. There were all these things that they wanted people to be afraid of: Ebola, ISIS, immigrants at the border. But literally, there were ads, shorthanded, where there were Ebola-infected ISIS terrorists crossing the southern border. They just rolled the whole thing into a ball of fear. Yeah. It's always something. It's crime now, but it's also immigrants crossing the border. It's all sanctuary cities. If you consume right-wing media in this country, you are fed a steady diet of fear. All the things that you should be afraid of. And that's usually people who look different from you, who are black or brown. Anything is meant to put you in a hair trigger. At the same time, anytime there's any suggestion of just common sense, basic gun safety laws, that is used to convince people to go buy more guns. And what we saw in the Obama administration is anytime there was an effort to try to address this problem, not only did they rally their lobbyists to defeat these things in Congress, they would surge gun sales because they would go scare people to buy the guns. So it's these two things coming together. You should be afraid, and you should be buying guns before they're taken away from you by the government. And that is radicalizing a whole swath of the society while simultaneously arming them. And the only people who profit are the gun makers and some of the politicians who use this stuff, or some of the people on TV who use it to get ratings.
One of the things we used to, in the course of the Obama administration, you always had to observe the strange dual realities, the reality of people on the outside and on the right largely saying Barack Obama is going to take away your guns, and people on the left going, Barack Obama's not doing anything about gun control.
Why isn't he taking away the guns?
Yes, he's not doing anything to take away anybody's guns. That equally, there's these dual realities on the question of crime. What's actually happening in America versus what's happening in the dystopic kind of view of Fox News. I want to play a little mashup here of what we heard about just in the course of from last fall to last week, a little sampler, a potpourri, a tasting menu of how Fox News talks about crime in America right now. Let's play that.
That's the end of civilization. It exists in pockets around the world, Mogadishu famously. But if you think it's confined to Mogadishu, you haven't been to Chicago lately.
You want to go shopping in the Windy City? You might be risking your life.
Sadly, it comes as no shock. San Francisco spiraling out of control.
Everything is upside down. It's like this evil is spreading across the country.
Nick, we could play one of those all day. I mean, literally, you could make a mash that would go for 60 minutes of listening to Fox News hosts talk about whether it's back in 2014, there was a lot of discussion about vermin coming across the border. That's another kind of Trump trope, but all of it's driven by this perception of fear and driven by the notion that crime, like Chicago is Mogadishu kind of thing, right? That was kind of a poo-poo platter, literally, of what Fox News does when it talks about crime. When you guys look at this at Everytown, how do you try to turn that? What you guys have been effective at doing is trying to make people understand this problem in a different way and talk about it in a different way. That's a very powerful narrative that ends up having really negative real-world consequences. What can be done to try to combat those false narratives coming out of the right?
Well, we do this thing at Everytown, not very popular on Fox News, called looking at the facts, looking at the science. And what we've seen is when you look at states that have strong gun laws, for instance, you have lower rates of gun violence, lower crime. And the fact is that the very folks that decided to use taxpayer money to come to New York City just this week to have a circus show hearing on crime in Manhattan were hailing from states and districts with far worse gun crime problems. What we talk about is that gun laws matter. We have the stats. We have the data to back it up. And in fact, what we've seen as a political matter is that against these kind of talking points about there's crime, on the rise everywhere, one of the best retorts, especially for Democrats, is to say, what have you done lately to increase gun safety? What laws have you passed to actually protect the citizenry, instead of weakening gun laws, making us less safe and leading to the incidents that we've already talked about today, not to mention spiking road rage incidents, mass shootings every other day, stand your ground laws that are leading to 800 additional deaths a year. So it is really effective to come back to those folks that are creating a fiction. I was just outside on the streets of New York, and it wasn't as it was described in the House Judiciary Committee this week. But the way to combat it is with facts, and we have the facts on our side.
When Jim Jordan was up here last week for his hearing on crime, and Alvin Bragg, Nick put out a tweet. People were pointing out the crime rates in Ohio, which were much worse. The murder rates much worse than in here in New York. Nick put out a tweet that was an A+ tweet, which was, quote, well, Jim Jordan proved one thing today. New York is the theater capital of the world. Nick Splina, that is the last word for this segment. Thank you for coming on. Ben Rhodes, you're sticking around. When we return, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' war on Disney is convincing more and more people, including Republicans, that he might just not be ready to hit big league pitching. That story is next.
Things have not been going great for Florida Governor and threatened cat Ron DeSantis. His poll numbers are sinking. Donors are panicking. So yesterday he did the only thing a man can do. He bullied a cartoon mouse. DeSantis couldn't take control of Disney World, so now he's talking about what he can do to the land around the park. A state prison next to Disney. He's about to run for president, and his latest proposal is, I'm going to put Florida convicts next to your children.
Oh, Stephen Colbert, right on the money, talking about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and his futile efforts to strike back at Disney, as his stock in the 2024 GOP presidential primary field continues to shrink before he's even officially announced that he's entering the race. That fight with Disney comes as DeSantis is doubling down on his attempt to raise his political star through increasingly petty and ill-thought-out culture wars. Today, he expanded, with the help of the Florida Board of Education, his heavily criticized Don't Say Gay bill all the way up through 12th grade now. Even the right-wing Wall Street Journal editorial board is panning DeSantis, writing, quote, nobody emerges from this looking good. Mr. DeSantis is escalating a feud with a business, they're talking about Disney here, that risks alienating moderate and independent voters who otherwise support Florida's sex education law and his good policies. Joining our conversation, editor-at-large of The Bulwark, Charlie Sykes, plus Cornell Belcher, Democratic pollster, as well as president of Brilliant Corners Research, and Ben Rhodes, of course, still with us. Charlie, I got to ask, let's just start right here, because you're a man who ostensibly used to be a member of the Republican Party, know the Republican Party. Just tell me, in what world, do you have to step back from this? In what world is it good politics for a Republican aspirant to the presidency to be attacking the biggest private employer in the state and, the purveyors of Mickey Mouse?
In no world that I know, look, Ron DeSantis is desperate to be thought of as a fighter. Somebody, I am your retribution, Donald Trump said. And so Ron DeSantis wants to imitate that. The problem is that he picks lousy fights. He picks epically stupid fights. You not only pick, one of the state's biggest employers, one of the state's biggest economic engines, but a beloved cultural icon. And in a fight that pretty much nobody can remember what it's about. I mean, really, seriously. I mean, you can go Google this, but, Ron DeSantis is fighting with Disney about what? At this point, it's become about the fight. It's become about showing that Ron DeSantis, has titanium gonads as opposed to anything else. But this is another indication that it's not just that he's not ready for prime time, is that he lacks the instincts. He's going through the motions that he thinks will endear him with MAGA, but he's picking fights that he can't get out of, that make no sense, that become quagmires for him. And it's interesting that all this is happening before he even gets into the race for president.
Charlie, despite the fact you just said something about titanium gonads and Ron DeSantis, I'm going to ask you, I believe I just saw your lovely little dog there in the corner of the screen. Is that right?
Yes, this is Augie because it's thundering and he's very worried. So he needs to be right here so that he knows he's safe.
Well, if he wants to get in your lap, that's fine with us. No, not a problem. Cornell, if you were here, Ben would get into your lap too, and because it's thundering here and he might need some comforting from you. I mean, look, everybody's going after DeSantis right now. Trump's been beating the crap out of him ever since he started to make it clear that he was going to get in the race, DeSantis, that is. Yesterday, Chris Christie was down in D.C., and Chris Christie, talking about this Disney thing, had a comment that I think a lot of existing Republicans and former Republicans would all agree with. Let's play Chris Christie talking about Ron DeSantis right now. This was with Semaphore yesterday in D.C.
I don't think Ron DeSantis is a conservative based on his actions towards Disney. That's not the guy I want sitting across from President Xi and negotiating our next agreement with China, or sitting across from Putin and trying to resolve what's happening in Ukraine if you can't see around a corner that Bob Iger created for you.
So, Cornell, you're a Democrat, not a Republican. I know that sometimes it seems like Republicans are from Venus and Democrats are from Mars, and maybe they have different ways of doing things there. Clearly they do, because they nominated Donald Trump and still support him to a large extent. But just talk to us a little bit about the dynamics in this. You know, you've seen candidates before as they're about to try to get in a race, and somehow, rather than building momentum, he's like building anti-momentum as he prepares to enter this race. Talk about DeSantis' fortunes right now in that Republican race.
Yeah, no, this is not from a partisan standpoint, but just as an old political campaign hack. There are just fundamentals that the campaigning, and Chris Christie actually stole my line, because the whole idea of you can't outwit the mouse, how are you going to sit across from Putin? And one of the things that's awfully important, and I think we learned this from the Bush White House, is the ideal of presenting strength. And being a strong leader is really, really important for conservatives on the right. And he's failing to do this. Now, look, I don't begrudge him for getting into petty politics, because apparently petty politics is how you come up in the Republican primary now, see Donald Trump. The problem is, I don't know if you're ever going to out petty Donald Trump, right? In campaign 101, the guy who's in front of you, at some point, you're going to have to take out the guy who's in front of you. You're going to have to find some way to pull support away from the person who is in fact in front of you. You're going to have to give you a rationale, and I don't see what the rationale right now for DeSantis is. If you're going to be Trump, sort of petty Trump light, why am I going to take petty Trump light when I can have the real thing? One last thing, I do think the DeSantis campaign made a strategic error when he actually picked up Trump's talking points about the DAs and the Democrats coming after him for political reasons. Look, you've got to have the guy in front of you disqualified. And the top reason here was going to be, he can't win an election. He's got all these criminal problems. He's got all these corruption problems. The Sanders campaign made the strategic decision to not go after Trump or even sort of sidestep the question, but to in fact pick up the Trump talking points and take away what's potentially right now the largest disqualifier of Trump. He's now nullified that.
Cornell talked about petty Trump light. We're going to talk about petty Trump heavy in relationship to Ron DeSantis. That petty Trump heavy and Meatball Ron. What a crew. With Charlie Sykes, Cornell Belcher, and Ben Rhodes. We'll talk about that with all of them when we come back on the other side of this break. Not just Florida. We're also going to talk about how the red states under Republican leadership have become the laboratories for authoritarianism. Right after this.
Hey everyone, I'm Tom Llamas from Top Story on NBC News Now. Every night, Top Story is your news playlist. We take you to the front lines of the story, where it's actually happening, with NBC News journalists on the ground from all over the world. We cover what you need to know and bring your newsfeed to life. And now, Top Story is available as a podcast, so you can listen anytime and anywhere. Subscribe now for new episodes every weeknight.
Over the past few decades, and certainly the last few years, America has been engulfed in a lot of petty partisanship and polarization, with red states led by Republicans rolling back the principles of liberal democracy. In a new article in The Atlantic, Brian Klass argues that these red states undermining democracy have become test labs for authoritarianism in this country. And here's what his piece has to say about that. Quote, when Democrats win at the ballot box, Republicans may attempt to neutralize their power. Recently, the Tennessee House expelled 2 black Democratic representatives who led anti-gun protests in the state house. The protests they led were disruptive, but the expulsions were wildly disproportionate and likely motivated by race. Republicans voted to expel the 2 young black men, but not the older white woman who'd also participated. The attempt, as we all saw, backfired as both were swiftly reinstated. But that doesn't change the fact that Republicans tried to undo the will of the voters over a minor transgression. The botched effort in Tennessee is just one example of Republicans trying to invalidate elections by getting rid of Democrats who end up in power. Charlie Sykes, Cornell Belcher, and Ben Rhodes are all back. And Ben, this is a subject that I know you were fascinated by. You know, the gap between red and blue America, wider than it's ever been. But now it's not just wide, as in we kind of live in 2 Americas, but we live in one America that increasingly looks like not a different version of democracy, but a anti-democratic version of America.
Yeah, because it's not just about partisan agendas or political agendas. It's about a certain kind of authoritarian playbook that can be replicated in different places. And so changing the structure of how government works to advantage a right-wing agenda. And this way, they can look at foreign countries that have pursued these kinds of playbooks. But if you look at what's happening in different state houses, there's concerted efforts to learn from one another, and it's very well financed to do things like, obviously, redistricting around state legislative elections, to do things like if a governor gets elected of a state that has a significant Republican majority in the state house, they just begin to systematically remove the powers that the governor has. Copycat laws that are meant to take away rights from different people, whether they're abortion rights or whether they're LGBT rights. What we're seeing is a kind of methodical effort to turn state houses into these kind of laboratories where Republican majorities change not just what government does, but how it works and who it works for. And that's very dangerous because that's trickling up to meet the authoritarian trend from the top of the Republican Party. And this just shows we're in a very long struggle here to kind of beat back this tide.
Charlie, we used to see competition between the states, you know, where you'd see low tax states versus high tax states, low regulation states versus high regulation states. That's the way that, you know, we define the difference between red and blue America and the policies. Now it's something rather different. This kind of ties back to our discussion of DeSantis, you know, whose decisions to punish the Walt Disney Corporation, he's more or less admitted were a matter of personal pique. He was like, they decided to oppose me politically over Don't Say Gay. I decided it was within my rights to punish this company, this out-of-state company that was bringing California values into Florida, behaving like a petty dictator. What is it that, you know, you've seen a little bit of that happen in your state too, in Wisconsin at various times. Talk about that trend at the state level and how it is in some ways the seedbed for what we see at the national level in the Republican Party.
No, and it almost does feel like kind of a slow or cold civil war here. Look, it is not a new phenomenon. The power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what we're seeing in a lot of these states is you have Republican supermajorities in many cases because of gerrymandering. And when you have a supermajority and you believe that everything is at stake, and that you were at war with your opponents, that there is this cultural moment. You were talking about the politics of paranoia earlier. You know, if you convince yourself that everything is at stake, that the issues are black and white, and this is your moment, and you have this super majority, and you have to decide, are we going to use it? Are we going to use it to keep our enemies out of power, to get what we want, to push through our agenda? You will have that. And so in one state after another, where you do have these massive majorities, you have these caucus meetings where people say, you know, if not now, when? We need to do everything possible. We have to make sure that those people, the enemies of all that is good and true, never get back into power. And you're seeing that in Tennessee. You're seeing that in Florida. And you've seen it even in states like Wisconsin.
Cornell, real quick, Oklahoma, the governor has called on these officials in McCurtain County to resign. This is a case where the county commissioner lamented after a public meeting, secretly recorded. We now have the audio of this, where he talked about how he lamented the fact that you could no longer yank black people out of jail and, quote, take them down to Mud Creek and hang them up with a rope. It's good the governor's called on those commissioners to resign, but talk a little bit about this being another aspect of this kind of the difference between red and blue America right now. It's not just authoritarianism that's taking root, but it's also racist authoritarianism in a lot of these places.
Yeah, I know we're out of time, so I'm going to say this really quickly, and it connects with the previous conversation. I wish it was this ideology, but it's white nationalism, and it's racism, and very soon we're going to find out whether or not we believe in democracy or we believe in power, because in a decade and a half, we're going to be awfully close to a majority-minority country, and we're going to find out whether we really believe in democracy, one man, one person, one vote, or we just believe in power.
Cornell, thank you for wrapping that up real quick. If it was in my power, I would bend the space-time continuum, and you would have had like 4 or 5 minutes to speak. You'll come back. We'll talk about this more with Charlie Sykes and Ben Rhodes, all of them great guests. Thank you guys for coming on today. We're going to take a quick break, our last quick break, and we'll be right back after that. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday. Nicole, thankfully, returns tomorrow.
The battle over a woman's right to choose, global economic challenges, the ongoing threat to democracy. When you sign up for the MSNBC Daily Newsletter, you're signing up to have a deeper understanding of today's biggest issues. Every morning, you'll get insightful articles sent directly to your inbox, written by people you know and trust, like Hayes Brown and Mehdi Hassan, along with video highlights from your favorite MSNBC shows. Sign up for MSNBC Daily at msnbc.com.